Don't make children slaves. Why we choose not to have kids? Why aren't you having children? This is a question that countless young people in China face today. The answer is both simple and complicated. We are not having children, not because we don't want to, but because we can't afford to. This is not about shirking responsibility. It's about seeing the truth of our reality. The allocation of resources in Chinese society has long been completed, locked up by the powerful elite. The government, in the name of public policies, systematically drives ordinary people into deeper poverty and despair. Having children is no longer about extending happiness or creating families. It's about participating in a system designed to drain the last drop of resources from the common people. From childbirth to education, from healthcare to employment, every single step of the way is a nightmare for ordinary people. And the architect of this nightmare is not the free market or capitalism. It is the government. The government exploits and oppresses its citizens under the guise of public service, ensuring that the next generation is nothing more than slaves for their fiscal and political interests. Having children today means subjecting them to a life already predetermined by this system. From their first breath, they are labeled as taxpayers and workers' toll, destined to feed into the government's machinery of exploitation. We choose not to have children not because we lack the ability to, but because we know that for the vast majority of ordinary people, there is no future for their children in this society. Chapter 1. Childbirth, the starting point of government exploitation. 1. The unbearable cost of childbirth, pushing families to bankruptcy. Having a child in China is nothing less than a financial catastrophe for ordinary families. Medical expenses, hospital delivery costs, postpartum care, infant products, all of these costs are insurmountable for families earning average incomes. The government's so-called pronatalist policies are an empty gesture, with symbolic subsidies of a few thousand yuan that barely scratch the surface of what is needed. Take a family living in a mid-sized city. Prenatal checkups and delivery alone can cost between 20,000 to 30,000 yuan, 3,000 to 4,500 US dollars. Beyond that, monthly expenses for formula, diapers, and baby supplies add up quickly, often eating up a significant portion of the family's income. For low-income families, these expenses are outright devastating too. Women bear the brunt of government exploitation. The burden of childbirth falls disproportionately on women. Pregnancy not only takes a toll on their bodies but also destroys their careers. In China, reproductive rights for women are a myth. Many companies openly discriminate against pregnant women, using maternity leave as an excuse to block promotions or even terminate their employment. Women are forced to choose between motherhood and professional advancement, and the government provides no safety net to protect their rights. Worse still, after childbirth, women are often left to shoulder the lion's share of child-rearing responsibilities. In China's family structure, supported by the government's lack of action, women are treated not as equal members of the workforce but as breeding machines. Without sufficient public childcare services, subsidies for stay-at-home mothers, or a system for shared parenting responsibilities, women are trapped in a cycle of unpaid, unrecognized labor. 3. The real motive behind pronatalist policies. Why does the government want more births? It's not because it cares about families' well-being. It's because it needs a fresh supply of labor and taxpayers. As the population ages, the government faces mounting pressure to sustain its fiscal budget, and having more children is simply a way to solve that problem. For the government, ordinary people's children are not individuals with hopes and dreams. They are numbers, resources to feed into a crumbling welfare system. The rhetoric of encouraging childbirth is simply a thinly veiled attempt to ensure there are enough GDP growth and ensure the ruling class remains unchallenged. Conclusion: not having children is the last protest. We choose not to have children not because we don't love them, but because we love them too much to condemn them to a life of exploitation and despair. This society has nothing to offer ordinary families and their children but endless suffering, engineered and enforced by the government. The government has rigged the game, claiming all resources for itself while leaving ordinary people to fight over scraps. Bringing a child into this world is not a gift, it is a sentence. We refuse to participate in this system. Not having children is not an act of selfishness, it is an act of defiance. It is our final way of saying, if you won't give us hope, we won't give you the future you want. Not having children is our last freedom. It is our loudest cry for justice. It is our refusal to be complicit in a system designed to enslave us until the government is held accountable, until ordinary people are treated with dignity, until the system is rebuilt for fairness will not bring new lives into this broken world. People paying into Social Security and propping up a declining economy. Chapter 2. Education, a system of inequality built by the government. 1. The myth of education equality. The Chinese government often boasts about its commitment to education and the equality of the system. But the reality is starkly different. Education in China is not about fairness, it's about locking people into the socio-economic class they were born into. Take the example of school districts and the housing market. Families have to spend their life savings on outrageously expensive school district housing just to get their children into decent schools. These elite schools, often located in urban centers, are dominated by families from wealthy or politically connected backgrounds. Meanwhile, families in rural areas or less developed cities are left with overcrowded, underfunded schools that lack the resources to give their children a fighting chance too. From kindergarten to college, an endless cycle of government-enabled exploitation. The costs of education never stop. From expensive kindergartens to exorbitant fees for tutoring, ordinary families are forced to pour every last yuan into ensuring their children don't fall behind. But where does this money ultimately go? Into the pockets of local governments through land sales for school districts and into the education department's gray income. And when it comes to higher education, things only get worse. The government touts college as the key to a better future, but for rural and low-income families, sending a child to college often means accumulating unsustainable debt. Meanwhile, job prospects for college graduates remain grim, as we'll explore in the employment section. 3. Education is no longer a path to success, but a tool of enslavement. Education is supposed to be a pathway to upward mobility, but in China, it has become the opposite. For most families, it is a black hole of financial burden and dashed hopes. Children grow up under immense academic pressure. Parents are driven to bankruptcy to pay for tuition and tutoring, and even if students excel, their chances of breaking free from the system are slim to none. Instead of empowering families, the government has weaponized education as a tool to drain their resources and maintain control over their lives. Chapter 3. Healthcare, the machinery of extraction. 1. The lifelong burden of healthcare costs. Healthcare is another arena where ordinary families are ruthlessly exploited. From childbirth to routine checkups, to unexpected illnesses, medical expenses are the ticking time bomb that can bankrupt any family. While the government claims to have a robust healthcare system with universal insurance coverage, the reality is that most people end up paying exorbitant out-of-pocket costs. Whether it's overpriced medications or mandatory but unnecessary diagnostic tests, families are constantly at the mercy of a healthcare system designed to prioritize revenue over well-being too. Healthcare inequality in rural despair. In rural areas, the situation is even bleaker. Local hospitals are woefully underfunded and understaffed, leaving families with no choice but to travel to major cities for even the most basic treatments. The government's neglect of rural healthcare has created a two-tier system, one for the rich and urban elite, and one for the poor and forgotten. 3. Healthcare, a tool for fiscal extraction. At the heart of the problem is the government's insistence on treating healthcare as a source of revenue rather than a public good. Hospitals are pushed to generate profits, and medical staff are given financial incentives to prescribe unnecessary treatments or drugs. The healthcare system has been completely marketized, and ordinary people are the ones footing the bill. Chapter 4. Employment, the government's trap for the future. 1. The employment crisis for those children who manage to survive the hurdles of education and healthcare. The final destination is an utterly broken job market. Youth unemployment in China has soared to over 20% for individuals aged 16-24, with millions of university graduates unable to find meaningful employment. The government continues to hide behind falsified statistics and empty promises, but the reality is clear. There are not enough jobs, and those that exist offer pitiful wages and no security too. A lifetime of low wages and overwork. Even for those who manage to find work, the conditions are grueling. Ordinary people are forced into low-paying, exploitative positions, whether it's on factory assembly lines, delivering food as gig workers, or toiling in service jobs. Meanwhile, wages have stagnated, and the cost of living continues to rise. 3. Employment as the end game of exploitation for the government. The goal is simple: keep the majority of the population stuck in low-income, high labor jobs to sustain the economy. The children born into ordinary families are not viewed as individuals with potential, they are seen as tools to maintain.